So what I want to do is, in this time, I'll talk about a couple projects, but it really comes together to a particular thing that I've been thinking a lot about and how it intersects with art and robotics, and really about robots as metaphor. And one of them I just saw in the last 24 hours, as was mentioned earlier this morning. The Economist came out with a new issue. The special focus this week is on robots. And if you read it, they say something really interesting that I never heard before, but that a lot of the robot stories are immigrant stories. If you think about Asimov, and the early stories of robots were about robots as workers. It goes back to the definition of RUR, et cetera, that there are these workers. And there's something very interesting about that. And they say that I like this idea that the robots, these are not immigrants from the past or immigrants from another country, but they're immigrants from the future. I think there's something really interesting and insightful to think about in that. OK, so I want to talk about Freud. And this particular idea that he conceived of actually long before the word robot appeared. This was in 1916, and he wrote this essay called The Uncanny, or actually the Unheimlich. And it's really known as the aesthetics of repulsion. He really goes into this analysis of a series of texts and phenomena about what we don't have a word. We don't really have this word in English, and the best way to understand it might be to think about déjà vu. Now, we all know, pretty much have had experience with déjà vu. That's where you see something strange, but it's suddenly familiar, like you've encountered it before. And Unheimlich is almost the opposite, the inverse of that. That's where you see something familiar, but it's somehow at the same time strange. That's Unheimlich. And it's a very real phenomenon. It's not a hypothesis. It's been experienced by most people in the world in the same way that déjà vu has. And the term is a little bit odd if you really try to understand its etymology, as actually Freud does. He spends a lot of time on this. But the Heimlich is a term for familiar, but the Unheimlich is like unfamiliar. So it's been translated, I think badly, as uncanny. Doesn't really work. And strangely, canny derives from the word ken, which is kind of weird in its own right. All right, so we won't dwell on that too much, but there's actually been quite a bit written about Freud in the context of robots. In fact, he references robot in his original essay, references an android that was part of the story by E.T.A. Hoffman. And it's all about this idea of that particular uncanniness that you encounter when you're seeing something that you're not sure if it's alive or not. So there's quite a bit of a phenomena like this, and I think it accounts for a lot of our fascination with things like vampires, zombies, which are still very popular, and all kinds of robots and fiction, especially Gothic and other creatures that basically we encounter, but we're not sure of their status. Are they real or not? This is more recent. You may recognize this is from the birther movement. I don't know if we have any members here. These are lifelike babies that are traded, and women spend a lot of time carrying them around. Go online, you can find out a lot more information about it. But another term that came much later, only in 1970, was this idea of the uncanny valley. And Masahiro Mori in Tokyo came up with this idea that if you sort of plot loosely, and again, this is not a really exact graph, but if you sort of think of the affinity versus the realism, and I think everyone in the room is familiar with this famous plot, that there's this uncanny dip down here. And if you make robots that are too close to this uncanny valley, they'll fall in, and everybody will be kind of creeped out by them. Now, I think this is fascinating, and I've noticed one other thing I want to just throw out there as a conjecture, because I think there's actually another inflection point that happens out here. It's where if someone puts a little bit of artifice on themselves, like in the form of makeup, they actually look a little better. In other words, so I think there's a little dip at the end here. So that you go down here, it's a little less lifelike. If you think about you getting up at the first thing in the morning, the way you look, and then you kind of beautify yourself a little bit. So then you kind of move up here. There's more affinity when you put a little bit of artifice in. But if you overdo it, if you keep going down this, you'll start going into this sort of. So this is the third inflection point. I'm hypothesizing this is over here. But if you overdo it, you kind of get into this realm, which I hope you'll agree is not exactly what we desire in our artifice. OK, so back to Freud. The central idea, and I encourage you to read this essay if you haven't already, is that the Unheimlich is about the repression. And it's when repression is somehow accidentally revealed. And it really does fit this model. Freud talks about things like prosthetics. So when we encounter a prosthetic limb, but then we're not sure, and then we sort of find out it's not real. We have this reaction, sort of involuntary reaction to it. Someone in this room probably has experienced this. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and there's so much to be said about it. It's actually the basis of a lot of interesting artwork, actually from literature to a lot of work that sculpture, painting. Of course, our friend Stellark makes use of the uncanny in his own work. It's also part of one of the things about Eduardo Katz's fascinating GPS bunny was this question of whether it was real or not, whether it was a living thing or not. And I think that's part of why that art project has been so resonant over time. So this idea of what's real, what's not, how can we tell the difference, this kind of Turing test, if you will, of reality is something that's very persistent. Now, about 15 years ago, I want to say, or almost 20 years ago now, I collaborated with Eric and Mark and a few others, and we did a project to explore this idea. We did a laboratory, kind of a test online. It was an online laboratory, and it was inspired to some degree by the Milgram experiments, which you all know. And the idea was online, could we create some kind of similar kind of sense of dissonance or anxiety? And so what we did was we set up two $100 bills. These were brand new at the time. They were the new shape. And then we labeled one as A, one as B. And once you came into the laboratory, we assigned you one of the two bills. And you were given a small section of the bill. And you were asked if you wanted to, you were assigned a bill. Now, once you registered, you were asked if you wanted to perform one of these experiments on the bill. And we had a couple options. You could just observe it, or you could do a little puncture. But a couple options. But almost everybody selected the thermal test, which was to burn a small hole in the bill. Then you were presented with a reminder that federal law makes it's a federal, committing a federal crime to proceed with the test, and almost everybody went ahead and proceeded. But it was fascinating to us, this idea that just by clicking on that button, you were suddenly your habeas corpus. There was a question of whether it was real or not, and we can talk more about it later. The other project in this realm, as Eric mentioned, was the Telegarden that was in the mid-90s, where we connected a real robot to the web. And the idea was that we were really interested in a number of questions about, just in some sense, the contrast between the natural world not evolving and the artificial world or the synthetic world evolving very rapidly, and the web's instant gratification versus the fact that nature hasn't really changed in 100,000 years. So we're exploring a bunch of questions like that. But then what also we didn't anticipate, being engineers and not really gardeners, was that if you have a plot of 11 feet by 11 feet and you put it out in the environment and you let people come in online and start planting seeds, well, it very quickly became more of an exercise in the tragedy of the commons. So another thing that came up, and it was the question some people remotely asked, is there a garden? Like, how do I know there's a garden there? And it was really the distinction between virtual reality and distal reality. And so virtual reality is where there's something fake. It's just synthetic. It looks very real. And distal is where it's real, but it's distant, but mediated. And I think this question has even gotten more poignant in the years since then. In other words, there's more, as this gets better and better, this ambiguity becomes more and more acute, more subtle. So we worked on a book for what we ended up calling telepistemology, the questions of knowledge at a distance. What is knowable? And how does technology like the internet change our conception of knowledge? This is a project that I have never actually shown before, and I thought today is a perfect day. This is was something that was done at the Ars Electronica Center, and it was a follow-up to the Telegarden, but we decided to move from agriculture into urban city planning or something. But the idea was you could actually build constructions over the web. And so it was a very similar setup, but here you're able to pick up things, you could design things in a 3D modeling system, and then you could pick up these little bricks and build things with them. And what was interesting was this was in Austria, in Linz, Austria. And in the first week when we opened it up, someone came in and built a swastika. three-dimensional swastika. That did not go over very well. So the project was closed down very quickly after that. Now, one of the things we were interested in was, could we take this into even more of going beyond, having it in a museum setting, but could we go into emotional, like a more social setting, kind of like the things Carla's talking about. And we wondered, could you have a robot go into the White House? So we worked on a project called the Teleactor, and so this is, again, a collaboration with Eric. And the idea was, could you put a person, have a whole bunch of sensors and wireless networking so that they could communicate, and then they could move around, but people online would essentially drive. So the idea was, we worked with collaborators at MIT Media Lab, and the idea was, could they control, not just one person controlling another person, but many people controlling this teleactor, so they could share in the experience of being there, being present in some remote, interesting environment. Now, this raised, interestingly, some, remember that picture of Eric? That was just his girlfriend at the time. All right. Anyway, but it raised this question. Like, people were like, what is that? I mean, are you looking at me? Why do you have this camera, et cetera? So it started to raise these other questions. And I want to make this connection with the whole point that was raised earlier about surveillance and about drones, because I think this intersects here with the idea of being watched. And if you think about it, the language is very similar. We talk about that we're sitting somewhere, and we find out later there were cameras on us, and we say, that's creepy, right? I was being watched. That language is often invoked. And I think it's actually the same. It's the same thing. It's the unheimlich. It's this sense of that something was familiar, you thought it was one thing, but it was now you find out later it was unfamiliar. Someone was watching you. And this is, I think, becoming increasingly a sensation that we're going to experience, and we have to kind of understand and cope with. And I think that these things come together with the unheimlich, because that is about something repressed, something hidden observation being revealed to you. And we did a project, by the way, in this area where we took, on the anniversary of the free speech movement, we set up cameras over Sproul Plaza, and it would let people zoom in on students, and people in the campus got in a lot of trouble for that, so I won't really dwell on it, but I got called into the principal's office for that one. But I want to try and tie these together just in the last minute, which is about this idea of robots, Freud, robots, and surveillance. That they all really are linked in this idea of unheimlich, the uncanny. And I think they really come together. All this really comes to a head with the glass. I think this is freaking people out. And I don't think it's by accident. I think it's because the glass embodies both of these things. It's the uncanny double whammy, because you get it because it's kind of, you're being watched, you're not sure, and it looks kind of strangely alien or robotic at the same time. So by having all those effects kind of redoubled on you, it's extremely disconcerting to be encountered. So that's the last point I want to make, and we can talk about it later. Thank you.